This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Against Erasure, a photographic memory of Palestine before the Nakba, with a foreword by Mohammed El-Kurd. This unique, stunning collection of images of Palestine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is a testament to the vibrancy of Palestinian society prior to occupation. With accompanying text in both English and Arabic, this beautiful hardback volume tells the story of a land full of people deeply connected to their homes. By recording life in Palestine prior to Israel's founding, this powerful book helps us refuse Zionist attempts to deny Palestinian existence. Find Against Erasure at haymarketbooks.org, where readers in the US and UK receive free shipping on orders over $25 and £20, respectively. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Much discussion of the massive economic inequality that characterizes American society in the 21st century stays in the realm of abstract, bloodless statistics. The growing share of wealth that the 1% is gobbling up. The huge number of working-class Americans declaring bankruptcy over medical debt, or unable to pay swelling rents, or crushed by student debt. The statistics are plenty depressing. When reporting does flesh out the lives behind these figures, it's often tales of a deindustrialized worker, a young man rocketed through the school-to-prison pipeline, or a working mom homeless with her child because she can't afford an apartment. This work, of course, is essential. What we don't often get much of is a sense of the texture of life for capitalism's winners, including a variety of little understood forms of labor that make those super high-end lifestyles possible. Sociologist Ashley Mears' book, Very Important People, gives us some of that texture through a fascinating, often disturbing examination of the garish world of the global ultra-rich party circuit. Mears is a former model and the author of a previous book, Pricing Beauty, The Making of a Fashion Model, which is about labor conditions for models. Through contacts that she made writing that first book, for this book, she joined the club promoters and models, girls in promoters' parlance, who serve as something like human set pieces for the dream worlds for the super rich that are created at these VIP clubs. She chronicles the carefully choreographed displays of waste, such as bottle service and dance floor champagne wars, and unpacks the complicated and rigid social hierarchies that undergird them. Today's interview is guest hosted by Jacobin editor Micah Utricht, who has a fascinating conversation with Mears about this excellent book, which provides an in-depth look at what exactly the wealthy are doing with their money. It's a book about the cascading effects that their bottomless appetites for extravagance have on industries and on the entire society beyond these clubs. The promoters who are desperate to please their wealthy clients, and the women whose stereotypically good looks are central to that pleasure. While growing millions of Americans struggle to survive stagnant wages and ever-rising costs of living, this parallel universe of the ultra-rich is characterized by a kind of luxury consumption arms race, growing ever more wasteful and ever more self-indulgent. In fact, as labor's share of income declines and productive investment slows, this sort of conspicuous consumption has an ever greater role in keeping the wheels of global capitalism turning. More importantly, these habits of expending surplus value reveal something about the social world and moral economy of our ruling class, indices of their values, and the sort of lives they will fight to preserve. Very Important People chronicles one corner of that universe vividly and maddeningly. We've spent the past few months doing in-depth episodes on and around Palestine, and there's a lot more of that coming up soon. And given what's going on in the world, this world of super elite bottle service might seem obscene. And, well, it should, because it is. As we peer into these penthouse suites of the global political economic order, we should remember that this entire edifice of wealth rests upon a foundation not only of labor exploitation, but of brutal violence and dispossession. And it always has. Before we get started, if you're a regular listener to this podcast, then you know that it's overwhelmingly a listener-supported operation. Not only that, it's a voluntarily listener-supported operation, by which I mean we don't paywall anything to push you into contributing, because this podcast is a political education project, and we want every single person possible on Earth to listen. That only works, though, because listeners who can afford to contribute do so. If that is you, if you're a Dig listener listening right now, and you appreciate what we're doing here, and you can afford as little as $5 or even $1 a month, please contribute now. Depending on how much you contribute and where you live, we will also send you a book or books in the mail, or a tote bag, or a coffee mug. All contributors get our excellent newsletter written by the brilliant Ben Mabee, delivered to your email inbox. Please contribute now. That's patreon.com/thedig. There is a link in the show notes. Click it. Okay. Here's Ashley Mears, a professor of sociology and women's gender and sexuality studies at Boston University. She's the author of Pricing Beauty, The Making of a Fashion Model, and Very Important People, Status and Beauty in the Global Party Circuit. She is interviewed by my guest host, Jacobin editor Micah Utricht.
Ashley Mears, welcome to The Dig.
Yeah, thank you, Micah. It's good to be here.
So can we just start with the most basic kind of definitional work? What is your project in this book, Very Important People? What is this world that you described and participated in it? And who are the kinds of players that make up this world?
So, Very Important People, it's a little bit of a sarcastic title because it's about a space of nightclubs that are for VIP. So I went into VIP nightclubs in New York. That's where I had done my sociology PhD and had always been a little fascinated by what I saw in the meatpacking district. And so I undertook about a year and a half ethnography of going into these spaces and then following what I discovered was really a circuit of VIP nightlife. And I followed it from New York to the Hamptons in the summer, to Miami during the Electronic Music Festival, to the French Riviera, also during the summers. And the larger project interrogates the construction of status and all of the invisible labor that goes into making the space look like a space for very important people. And the kind of main actors that pull it all together are the rich men, and it's almost always men, who are buying bottles at hugely inflated prices in these clubs, and they're also taking out yachts and renting mansions and kind of making a big display of their wealth. And part of what makes their status most visible is the presence of very beautiful women, but beauty defined in very narrow terms of what the fashion modeling industry prescribes as beautiful, which is tall, thin, disproportionately, not exclusively white, young women. And then the people that bring them together are the nightclubs, specifically these people who are called party promoters or image hosts. And they're hired by the club to find these kinds of women, mobilize them to get them to come out night after night, and then also to build relationships with the clientele and get these, make the party happen. So my point of entry really was the promoters. I could tell you a little bit about the methodology if you want, of how I pulled this off. So when I was at NYU studying sociology, I was working at the time as a fashion model for my dissertation, which was about the labor economics of the modeling industry. And I did that work in New York, but also in London. And what I found in that project from going to the castings was that there's a bunch of men who work for nightclubs that are also hanging out at castings, and they make it their job to befriend models, build relationships with models, and then bring those models out for a free night. And I'm putting free in quote marks here because there's no such thing as a free gift, we know. But basically, when I finished my dissertation and it became a book called Pricing Beauty, I got my job in Boston, and I was working towards tenure here. But I kept getting the text messages from these promoters that had met me at the castings. And they kept inviting me to come back out, like, hey, baby, come for the sushi dinner. And I was looking for a project, and I wasn't sure what I would study for my next big ethnographic project. But at the time around then, it was 2010, 2011. And that was in the wake of the economic crisis and actually the recovery and, Occupy Wall Street. So there was an extremely uneven recovery, and it became very clear that the people who rebounded back most quickly from the Great Recession were the economic elites. And I was reading these reports of like oligarchs going to nightclubs in London and outspending each other on, thousands of dollars of Cristal champagne. And I kept getting these messages from the promoters who were like, do you want to come to the Hamptons this weekend? And so I just replied one day, like, yes, I want to come to the party. I want to see what's going on. And I really wanted to understand how this level of ostentation and conspicuous consumption was still possible, and what were the meanings and what were the values that were circulating among the economic elite, who are notoriously really hard to study, especially for a qualitative researcher like myself. I mean, I'm an ethnographer, and that means that I try to get as close as possible to the lives and the everyday reality of the people that I want to study. The economic elite, of course, they have like walls up, they have privacy, and they have lawyers, right? So it's really hard to get into the elite. And so I found this sort of back door of getting in with the promoters who are servicing the elite and constructing this VIP global circuit for them. And what I did to get close to the promoters was I used what we might call my own bodily capital, right? Like the resource that I had. I mean, I couldn't spend my way into this circuit as a sociology professor, obviously. But at the time I was like 31. I could still kind of pass for a fashion model, which was my background before I got into academia. I modeled, and that's why I had this interest, to do my dissertation on the labor economics of the modeling industry. So I put on my high heels and my party clothes, and I went back out and became what promoters would refer to as a girl, which is a woman who goes out and adds value to the space by embodying that kind of beauty that everybody can recognize as high status. So I had a short window of opportunity, I think, to like get in and do the project.
To me, everything you've just described is fascinating in its own right, just to understand what is going on in this social world that I certainly have nothing to do with. Didn't even fully understand that it existed in a serious, tangible way. But also because beyond the specifics of this world, I was fascinated in your book in terms of what it says about increasing economic inequality in the United States and across the world, and the kinds of social spaces that have been created seemingly as a result of that inequality, and that when wealth concentrates more and more at the top of our society and of the world, that has sort of trickle-down effects in the rest of the society, right? People aren't just getting richer and hanging on to more of their riches. They have an incredible amount of resources, seemingly endless resources for some of the people who you talk about in the book, to create this kind of habitus, to engage in ritualistic displays of their purchasing power as a way that can, project their wealth, and that also communicates certain kinds of values to, the people who are watching these rituals. And it really truly celebrates these kind of this orgy of consumption. And so it's fascinating to see that this is what at least some subsection of the global ultra wealthy are choosing to do with their wealth.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that sums up like really well the larger motivation that I had in the project and what I had hoped to convey, because It's always a problem when you do an ethnography of a case, especially the cases that I'm drawn to. They look like frivolous things, right? Like fashion and beauty and consumption. I mean, these are very marginal topics in sociology, which has largely been interested in understanding production, and like industrial relations and, well, more essentially worlds of men. But these topics, I think, they seem frivolous, but they have really serious implications. Specifically, you might not have understood that this world really existed, but in pop culture, it really plays an outsized role because the visibility on Instagram and in rap lyrics and, just in pop culture of our like media saturated environment is kind of dominated with these ideas of status being generated through conspicuous consumption. But it's not just about, showing that you have some money. It's increasingly gets ratcheted up when you have huge pools of wealth that are buying not just art, but like extremely expensive contemporary artworks, right? And not just a yacht, but a super yacht. Yeah. So you have this like kind of increasing concentrations of wealth and then ever ballooning means of displaying them. And I think that the VIP club world is just one of many examples of these areas of kind of ostentation that constructs an aspirational world of luxury consumption. You see this in fashion, of course. Like you can see it in so many aspects of life in which everyday people are called upon to consume, to show their identity, to show their status, and there's a kind of baseline field of possibility that just gets pulled upwards when you start seeing that, why would you go to a regular club when, other people are going to the very exclusive club? And why would you go to the very exclusive club when other people are going to the very exclusive super yacht that's in the French Riviera? So it kind of pulls the field of dreams and the field of possibility ever farther against this long tail of inequality.
You write in the closing chapter of the book that you analyzed in the book, quote, the VIP party circuit as a transnational stage for the display of luxury consumption in which status, connections, and economic value accrue to the new global elite. To understand status dynamics among the upper echelons of an unequal class structure, we must come to grips with the social significance of their consumption. Hardly a fringe phenomenon, the VIP circuit demonstrates a historically significant moment, a form of status acquisition made possible by the conditions of 21st century capitalism, unquote.
Yeah. So it's true. It's made possible by the conditions now, particularly the availability of being globally mobile and being able to broadcast one's position, through things like social media. So the stage is much bigger than ever before. But it also has a historical lineage. When I was thinking through what does it mean that somebody would go to a club, assemble 10 or 15 or 20 fashion models around them, buy, as many bottles of high-priced Cristal champagne and not even drink it, but like gift it or shake it and spray it in the ritualistic champagne showers that I saw in Saint-Tropez. Like what is this form of behavior? And it led me to think first through conspicuous consumption, which the economist Thorstein Veblen had written at the turn of the century when he was documenting the new industrialists of America who were finding ever creative and outlandish ways to display their status and kind of seemingly ratcheting up of one-upmanship competition, right? Like you get this, but I'll get that bigger, and up it goes. Yeah. So that's the conspicuity and the sort of will to dominate, meaning to show your status is bigger than somebody else's status through consumption. But that line of thinking that Veblen was working on also had a lineage. I mean, when we think about consumption rituals that anthropologist Franz Boas was documenting among Pacific Northwest tribal societies and what became called the potlatch. So the potlatch was documented as a form of ritual squandering in which tribes would gather together, or a tribal elder would gather people together and show off like how much he had by how much he could waste. Who gives the biggest feast? Who can, destroy precious things like coppers or blankets? And they were solemn affairs, right? They weren't the sort of exuberant events that I was finding. And they really did matter for solidifying rank. So they had serious consequences, and they could leave people with a serious sense of shame if they were outdone. So the metaphor, doesn't stretch perfectly, but it does help us think about this quest for status through waste, and consumption as a kind of waste, as a means to assert one's position in a competitive spirit. And so I took that notion of potlatch, and I started to kind of see it in this VIP clubbing arena. And it doesn't happen all the time, right? Like, not every night is a champagne shower with the whales. And they're called whales, the really big spenders, the people that'll spend, upwards of 20, 50, even 100K in a single night. That term whales from finance and casinos. It's people that make really big splashes with money. And so when whales come through, everybody gets very excited, and they make sure that they have the very best supplies of champagne and the very best supplies of beautiful women. And because the hope is that people will spend a lot of money, and then the club can capture that. And they really were exuberant nights. I mean, the bottles come out with sparklers, these little fireworks that burn in the club. It's very, very clear effort to be conspicuous, right? So it very much draws the eye, so you can see who's spending what. The models are expected to wear very tall high heels. I should add very uncomfortable high heels as well that are like 4 inches tall. And this also means, models are already like starting at 5'9" or 5'10". So it means that they're also towering in the club, that also draws the eye. So everything is meant to kind of showcase who are these people who have the most money in the room, because they're wasting it, and they're signaling it. And that's an effort to transform economic power into symbolic prestige. I mean, and we see this in many other forms, not just consumption of material goods, like in the art market, but you could think of philanthropy as a similar kind of effort to sometimes whitewash money, or just to convert money into status. And so it's new, but it's also quite old.
We'll get into some of the specifics of the world in a second, but I just have to say near the top here that your book is an academic sociology book. You're describing the scene not with a sense of sort of like moral judgment one way or the other about it. You're just providing an ethnographic description of what this world looks like. But for me, as a reader who came to read the book with certain moral and political commitments, I have to say that times in the book, I was thinking indicative of a terminal decadent phase of a society here. I mean, just like this feels like really like, popping bottles in the club, dropping 50, 100K a night while the world is burning around us. Like, history is not going to look kindly on the people who are spending their time in this historical moment, choosing to engage in these kind of ritualistic forms of conspicuous consumption here. It's parts of it were kind of tough to read on a moral level, I have to say.
Yeah. No, I've heard that people have described it as ridiculous, which has both a disdain and a humor in it. This term to ridicule, but people have described it as disgusting and like with horror that they read it. But I really did want to be fair to the people that I researched, because I approached it with not moral outrage, but really like curiosity. Like, how is this possible? And what's the logic that sustains this world? And I will say that when I interviewed the spenders, the clients who were buying bottles, I would recruit them either through promoters or through other networks, or I would recruit them just in the club. We might go to dinner beforehand with a promoter, or I would just be standing next to them in the club. The music is very loud and like the lights are low. It's not like conducive for good conversation. But I would get their contact information and ask to follow up. And I would explain that I'm a writer and I'm interested about nightlife. I'd be really curious to know, what you think of all of this. And then when we did interviews, it would be in a quiet coffee shop, or it would be at their office, let's say. And in interviews, these rich people would describe their own spending as quite measured, modest by comparison. So always put it in a comparative perspective. Like they're not the worst spender. They're not the biggest whale, or they would describe themselves, their current consumption in reference to a former self, right? Like I did this when I was young, but now I'm mature and I know better. And they too shared this, I wouldn't say outrage, but a moral unease with spending in this way. And I think that that's because everybody knows that ostentation violates like a basic middle class, widespread norm of like how to be disinterested, but furthermore, status is a sensitive good. It's not something that you can buy easily, because the moment that you do, you lose status, right? You're seen as like a status-seeking kind of person, and therefore shallow and inauthentic. And everybody embraces this discourse of authenticity now. And so they would often talk about their logic of wanting to be a part of this scene in relation to their work lives, especially for people in tech or people in banking, also in real estate and other forms of financial services. They would talk about being in the VIP space as a way to meet other VIPs like themselves with whom they could do business, that they, there's many opportunities to enrich their social networks. If they're in these kinds of spaces, you're a part of the club. If you go to Saint-Tropez, right? If nothing else, then you can talk about it and have this shared pursuit of being in the know of the right places to be. And some of them were also, some of the clients that I interviewed would also talk about the importance of being in a VIP club for them to bond with other people in their office, let's say, or they would see it as a sort of efficient means to go out, especially for people who are working in finance. They're working 60 hours a week or more. And so they don't have an abundant amount of time to meet women themselves, and to assemble a party themselves that they would want to be at. But the VIP club is kind of organized in a way that they can go and share the tab, 10K split between 5 bankers becomes much more reasonable in their minds. So on the whole, in those quiet moments of interviews, I could capture how rich people themselves are quite uneasy with this form of consumption. And they would talk more about their work lives. And some of them also shared this work hard, play hard discourse. Yeah. And so they saw themselves as deserving of these occasional breaks, because everybody knows that spending on this scale is not deserving, right? Like this is like the bad rich behavior, and they wanted to distance themselves from that. So I think this is the benefit as a qualitative researcher of combining interviews with ethnography, because in the moment, people can act really outrageous and kind of revel in it. So when the champagne bottles are coming out, these discourses of like, I'm a moderate spender, or like, I'm not that undeserving kind of wasteful person. All of that goes out the window. And that's because the club is really good at suspending rationality and creating a different world in which the value really is being seen and outdoing other rich people, and creating a pleasure in that, like a pleasure in waste. And like when it goes well, I mean, a club is very good at orchestrating it. Like should I go into the minutia of how they do it? Yeah. So when 2 big spenders come to a club, they seat them in a particular way so that, you don't put them near the bar, because that's where, the filler or like the civilians are going to buy their drinks at the bar.
Yeah, you have these very in-depth descriptions of the like physical layouts of the club. You have a diagram at one point. You talk about the very intricately scripted and determined, like this kind of person at the club who has this kind of money sits here. These kind of people, the idea of the filler, like they're there because you need bodies in the club, but they're not the ones who are going to be engaging in the champagne wars or whatever. It's a very rigid social hierarchy within the club space itself.
Yeah, exactly. And so they'll put the 2 whales, or the big spenders kind of opposite each other close to the DJ, because that's the focal point of the action. They'll move the table where the promoters have brought all of these beautiful girls. They might be sitting, at a table on the left, but they'll move them to the right to be closer to the big spender on the assumption that, more models, more bottles will be sold. I mean, there's definitely like, it's a well-planned architecture in this space that enables the show, such that if you were an outsider and you walked in, you might think that it looks like this spontaneous show, right? And it just so happens that there's so many, very good looking and very wealthy people that's very clearly demarcated in gendered lines as well. And you would think it sort of happens spontaneously. but it's very highly orchestrated.
So I want to talk about the role of the girls and the promoters in just a minute, but to stay focusing on the whales and the clients for a minute. When you describe in the book your interviews with these clients who are ordering this bottle service in these clubs, it made me think of the sociologist Rachel Sherman when she writes in her book Uneasy Street about the lives of very wealthy people in New York City. I remember that in that book, she discusses how many of them sort of relativize their wealth. These are like the 1% or even the 0.1% in some cases, but they seemingly are able to sleep at night by being able to say, well, yes, I'm very wealthy, but at least I'm not like that person over there. That person is like they're truly wealthy and they're engaging in the truly conspicuous displays of consumption and truly wasteful forms of consumption. And so it becomes a way to relativize and to sort of, as I said, allow themselves to fall asleep at night saying, well, at least I'm not like that kind of rich person over there. I may be engaged in some kind of over-the-top spending, but I'm nowhere near the worst. And so that becomes a way for them to justify their own spending and behavior. That happens on the one hand. On the other hand, also, there is a kind of rational economic sense for some of these clients, right? I remember at one point in the book, you discuss somebody who says, yes, I went out to the club and brought several potential business partners, and we dropped $50,000 there. But in the club, I secured this $250,000 business deal. So, $50,000 investment for a certain kind of experience with this client resulted in a $250,000 deal. Can you talk about the construction of that kind of world? You reflect in the book on how it's important for these businessmen to have a kind of shared set of social experiences with each other that it shows that you are a part of this sort of VIP class, which then if you can establish that with the person, then it says, okay, this is the kind of person I can do business with. So can you talk about that dynamic?
Yeah, sure. So this is also a double-edged sword because for a lot of people who are going out into the club and spending in ways that are perceived as reckless, nobody would want to do business with them, right? And this is why you see generally it's younger men who are buying bottles. It might be sons of successful entrepreneurs or themselves kind of early entrepreneurs. You generally don't see men in their like 50s or 60s that are dropping tabs like this unless they're like the recent divorcees and they're like out for a wild one off. But on the whole, it's younger people. And I'm reminded of the rich kids of Instagram. Do you know that Tumblr? It curates the kind of most ostentatious and offensive pictures of young people that are wasting champagne in extremely creative ways. My colleagues, Bruno Cozin and Sebastian Chauvin and I, created a database. We're still working on the paper in which we document, what are the different forms of conspicuous consumption. And we documented dozens of different ways of wasting champagne, pouring it in your dog's bowl, pouring it in your bubble bath, drinking it underwater. I mean, come on, right? But like, it's called Rich Kids of Instagram, and there's no children, right? It's just like younger people. And it's behavior that would come with certain risks and liabilities for older elites who have more responsibility and are assumed to not be, spending in ways that are seen as reckless. So yeah, the rich clients that I spoke with, they would often talk about the importance of spending in relation to their work lives. Like, yeah, I spent money at the club. I know it looks bad, but I got a business deal out of it. But it's really hard as an ethnographer to actually follow that through and try to examine like what really are the institutional ties and consequences for elites that participate in this scene. I would say that what I captured is rather an interesting discourse about how important it was for them to show that they are serious as workers. And I think that's because they know that it looks really bad to be consuming in these ways, right? They are in some ways spending on a level that is on par with the dominant critical discourse of the undeserving poor. You know, the undeserving poor are people who are seen as not working for their money, getting welfare from the government, and spending on irresponsible things. Yeah, and the discourse of the undeserving poor gets brought up, time and again, and adds all kind of destruction to efforts to create a stronger safety net. But you could also think of like wealthy people are also aware of multiple forms of stigma on wealth itself. And we know from lots of social science data that both rich and poor people alike tend to describe themselves as closer to the middle than they really are, right? Like everybody wants to seem middle class in America and not be the outliers. And like, who would be the undeserving wealthy? It would be somebody who didn't earn their money, who's not working hard, right? They're inherited their money or they're entitled. And it would be somebody who's spending badly, right? Whose like consumption habits reveals that they don't deserve the money that they have because they're spending recklessly. So I think that what I captured in the interviews was an effort for the rich to show themselves on an appropriate moral or symbolic divide of being a good wealthy person, even though they were clearly engaging in pretty tacky behavior.
I don't know how indicative he is of all of the wealthy clients that you included in the book and that you interviewed, but I have to read this quote from Sam during one of the interviews you did with him. Yes.
Yeah.
You're asking him about these rituals, and he says, quote, "I've never seen anything like it. It's disgusting, kind of. I thought about this before, like, is this wrong? Is this a bad use of money? And I don't think it is, because it's money spent that creates a lot of good. The money's not better spent on, like, welfare. I mean, I just told you I love Charles Murray," unquote. Charles Murray, of course, is the right-wing social scientist who many people describe as advancing very openly racist views, not to mention ones in defense of wealth and privilege and hierarchy. Quote, "But really it's money that's going back into the economy. And I don't think it's better to just give that money like to a homeless person or anything. So when I say it's disgusting, I'm not approaching it from the lens of let's feed the starving babies," unquote. That just sort of speaks for itself, I have to say.
Yeah. So he's so Sam, who works in finance and would describe himself as very hardworking, and indeed, I think he puts in a lot of hours at his job. Yeah, he's indicative of one extreme pole of people who think that trickle down economics works, and they're fine with luxury consumption in all of its forms, as opposed to more redistributive means of allocating funds. But what he really took issue with, and in this he was much in this he had a lot in common with the other wealthy clients that I interviewed. He really took issue with the fact that when somebody is buying luxury experiences, or when they're say in this scene purchasing those bottles, they're too obviously status seeking, that they're doing it for the status. And that, in his view, is the immoral part.
So we've been discussing the clients, the people around whom this whole world revolves, because they're the ones who are spending the money. But you also spend maybe the majority of the book talking about promoters and girls. So can you talk about these two players? Who are they, and what role do they play within this world? And why is it that the clients that we were just discussing want these girls to be present in these clubs so badly?
I'll start with the promoters because they were my entry point, and I spent the most time with them in the field. Promoters are hired on a nightly basis as they work as independent contractors for clubs to bring in the right crowd. That's beautiful women and people, mostly men with money. And the promoters they all share a really interesting story about how they ended up in this job, which, by the way, starting out, they could make $200 a night. But if they're proven to bring in a high volume of beautiful women, what they call the quantity of quality, they can make upwards of $1,000 a night. Imagine they're working 5-6 nights a week, and then they get hired for private parties to, fly girls to Saint-Tropez or wherever. So they have this sort of, jet set lifestyle and access to really wealthy people around the world. So they kind of understand, and their own backgrounds are not from privilege. The majority of them that I followed and that I met didn't come from money or go to college or finish college, but they had this incredible relational skill where they're really easy in talking with women. They have no qualms at all of like picking up women on the street. And in fact, that's part of how they recruit young women to be a part of their network. They drive these big SUVs and park them in specific places in New York, like in Soho, right where all the modeling agencies and the casting agencies are. And then they'll just hop out of their car and go follow a woman down the street and then compliment her, talk with her. Oh, you're from Poland. My girlfriend's from Poland. You're going to have so much fun. We're going to have a birthday party tonight. Come out. They get their phone numbers and then they just keep inviting them and calling them to come out.
Let me pause you there for a second. Because you describe this, you see this scene yourself over and over again on the streets of New York City. And this is just another thing that the average person has no idea is going on, that these promoters are out on the streets chasing around beautiful women all the time. And assumedly, if you are a woman who fits this description of physical beauty in the streets of New York City, you are used to being chased around by these promoters, being stopped in public all the time and them trying to get you to come out with them. This is just like a normal part of your life at this point.
Look, I think that beautiful women are attracting all kinds of attention, wanted and unwanted. So it's one of many encounters on the street that she would have. And by the way, I met promoters myself when I was 19. And my first trip abroad to try modeling overseas, I went to Milan, and the modeling agency arranged my apartment, and they said, "Oh, someone will meet you at the agency to bring you to your apartment." So I thought it was somebody that worked at the agency, right? And I was a college student, so I didn't have very much money, didn't speak Italian or anything. So Maximo met me at the airport, helped me with my luggage, and then invited me to dinner and to a club, that night and every night thereafter. And at first I was like, "What a nice guy!" Oh, how great! There's a party tonight, and then it took me a while to understand he didn't work for the agency. He worked for the club, and the promoters will also ingratiate themselves with model agencies and be a part of this economy of favors. So the promoters are helping the agencies, so the agencies will introduce them to girls. They're helping the girls. They drive those SUVs so that they can fit more bodies in the car and drive the girls to their castings. And this is an important service, especially for a newcomer to a city who doesn't know her way around, maybe can't afford lunch that he's going to treat her to, doesn't know very many people. So he helps her with establishing a network of connections and opens all kinds of doors to her in the city, that the kinds of opportunities, being in a nightclub or being in a glamorous restaurant, even with a subpar meal, because often these are the free dishes that the kitchen is bringing out to the models, but getting access to that does make the girls, it kind of lines up the expectation of what a fashion model is and what the lifestyle of fashion is, which is very glamorous and very rich, right? But the reality of the modeling industry, what I found in my first book, is that the majority of models don't make very much money at all. And many of them are in debt to their agencies, and they're living quite precariously in these very expensive cities. So promoters are kind of opening all of these opportunities to them, giving them all kinds of favors, building experiences, building ties with them. A promoter told me that there can be no night without the day. So the daytime, it might start late because they're up all night. So, but around by like 12 or certainly 2:00 in the afternoon, promoters are back at work, which for them, their work is relational work. It's building relationships and building this economy of favors and getting the girls indebted to him in a way that doesn't feel like a transaction, right? But feels like a friendship, friendship is accumulated debt and reciprocity. Yeah. So that's what they're doing strategically with the girls. So promoters are really good in in being friends, I would say, for a living. Like that's their job.
So can you describe, let's say, just give us a example of a promoter on the street in Soho who sees a model walking by. If he successfully convinces her to go out with him, can you describe that situation for her from that initial conversation? What happens after that? What are the steps that lead them all the way to the club?
Okay, sure. So this is one of many ways that promoters will recruit young women into their network. So he'll approach her on the street, get her phone number. The critical thing is to get the phone number, because if you get her phone number, then you can text her, you can let her know what's going on. You can invite her to things that are unrelated to nightlife, right? Like, let's go bowling, like we're going to the movies, or here's lunch, or let me drive you on a rainy day. Yeah. So the economy of favors kicks in. And then a promoter will assemble the girls, again, driving in the city to go pick them up, to bring them to the meatpacking district. And it's not even driving in Manhattan anymore. It's also the real estate has become so expensive in New York that model apartments are now in Jersey or they're in Brooklyn. And so it's not a small favor, to get a ride from a promoter. And then there's a free dinner. And the restaurants are often either owned or operated by somebody who's connected to the club. And so promoters will get a comped meal. And, comped is compliments of the house. But also it's also quite a compliment, I think, to get into a chic restaurant and get treated to a free meal. The meals are hit or miss, I would say, because because they're free, the kitchen is just sending out plates. So it's often family style. Usually you don't order off of the menu. Dinner could really be like at a sushi restaurant, it might be leftover cucumber rolls, right? So I always ate before I went out, but dinner will be around 10, wraps up around 12. And then the promoter will bring the girls to the club, and he's hoping for, at least around 8, give or take. The more, the better. And when promoters get to the club, they're assigned a table to stay at, and then they get free drinks. And, it's usually not the best champagne, but, whatever Prosecco or like white wine is available. And then the promoter really has a tough job at that point, I would say, because it's already been a long day for him. And at that point, he has to make it fun for the girls, and he has to embody the life of the party. So many promoters are really systematic about it. They don't drink. I mean, some of them do, of course, but the ones that had been in the game for the longest time, like 20 years, they didn't drink alcohol, but they were really good at rousing affect, dancing, flirting, joking, toasting, if trying to keep the energy up for the club, which is really hard. I mean, some promoters, it's a huge amount of emotional labor.
Sorry, before you go on, you just described a minute ago the part of getting the free meal for these girls, which is no small thing if you are broke, right? You're happy to have someone paying for your meal, but also the provision of that meal by the promoter creates a sense of expectation that you are going to then accompany the promoter to the club, right? You described multiple times yourself being confronted by promoters when you tried to leave after the meal, not go with them to the club. They were very insistent that because you had showed up to the meal, you are now expected to do this kind of labor for them in going to the club.
That's right. I got scolded a few times when one accused me of the dine and dash. Like, you can't do a dine and dash, which is a really telling moment in fieldwork, because it reveals that this is a transaction, right? This is not just a gift that's building up a friendship that I do have an obligation to repay the debt. And usually that is kind of under the veneer of like, let's have dinner together, or let's go for a drink at the club together. But really the promoter's watching the clock, because he needs the girls to be at the table for 4 hours, and he needs them to stay at the table so that his table doesn't look empty, right? Because at some point the manager of the club is going to be circling around and seeing which promoter has the quantity of quality. Yeah. So for the most part, I think promoters are going to illustrate the ways. Of course, we're always intertwining intimacy and money in our relationships all the time. Promoters are just much more strategic and explicit because it's their job, but they're really good at hiding it, right? And making it feel like leisure, not labor, like friendship, not debt, and so on. But there are these moments where it goes wrong, right? If one partner doesn't oblige by the unspoken terms of their engagement, then it comes out that like, no, I paid the gas to get you here tonight. I need you to stay for 4 hours. That's the terms of the deal. And so usually it's unspoken. So it's in those moments of violating or breaching that you get the real explicit consequences.
So you just mentioned that the promoters have rounded up these girls, brought them to dinner. The expectation is that they now go to the club. You have to get in the door of the club, which is not the easiest thing in the world. And you describe in some detail what that looks like, what the parameters are for whether or not you're allowed in the door, what the doormen, what their expectations are, and the kind of balance of the crowd that they have been instructed to allow through the front door. Can you talk about those dynamics?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's an interesting moment of socially acceptable discrimination at that moment when somebody is trying to come into a club. They're assessed in very, very different terms by gender. So, men can come in with money, and women can come in with beauty. And again, it's beauty of a very narrow sort. So at one club, the door person is instructed not to allow any woman in that's shorter than herself. And she's 5'7". So, in heels, she's a bit taller. And there are moments where even models are told that they can't come in because they don't have the right shoes. They don't have the high heels. There's a moment where I was following promoters all day long and I didn't have time to run home to get my high heels. And I'm really nervous when I'm walking in the door if I'm going to make it in. And I did make it in, but the promoters are commenting, "Where are your heels?" So it's very clear that for women, they must have this recognizable bodily capital to come in. And those moments can also be extremely painful. So there's lots of instances where people describe being rejected or witnessing rejections that are quite punitive. So women who don't meet the bar of beauty are really fiercely excluded because shorter women or heavier women, women that don't conform to looking like fashion models, they threaten to lower the status of the space. And so they're treated really with a lot of hostility. It's quite common to hear the term midget was used to refer to a woman who was like under 5'6", and promoters embraced this language as well, because promoters also inflate their value by being surrounded by tall, beautiful women. So they see women, women who don't look like that are a threat to the promoters as well. And promoters have different ways of dealing with what happens when a woman who doesn't meet their criteria of beauty tries to come into their group, and it's an issue for them because like a girl who's coming out wants to bring her friend or wants to bring her cousin who's out of town or whatever, but the friend is only 5'5", and the promoter has to tell her that she can't come on the basis of her beauty, and that's another breach of this implicit contract that everybody is here as friends, right? Everybody is here for leisure, but you have to be at least ideally 5'9" to participate, or you have to be wearing the right clothes to participate.
In addition to these highly gendered aspects of who gets let in and who doesn't, I was shocked to read that there is clearly an instruction to these people working the doors to let in an almost entirely white crowd, which I found fairly shocking. Not something that you would expect in New York City, the cosmopolitan capital of the United States, that they are very intent on maintaining a mostly white environment.
Yeah. So at the time that I was doing the field work, it was not uncommon to be in a VIP club in the meatpacking district, right, or the Hamptons or Central Pay, and it would be almost entirely white people, with the exception of the staff. So the people who are working security, or the people like promoters who are disproportionately brown and black men. The elite is not often thought of as a space to examine dynamics of white supremacy, but that's because it's the unmarked category of mostly white people, right? I think elites are an excellent case to try to understand the formation and the protection of whiteness, and also masculine privilege.
In the last few years, especially, there's been significant examination of discussions of white privilege and all the rest of it, feminism, people reading Robin DiAngelo. This clearly has not seeped its way into the VIP club scene.
Yeah, I mean, I did the field work 10 years ago. So it's possible that this has changed with the embrace of diversity and the rhetoric of inclusion that you see across all levels of society and sectors. So I would be surprised if there wasn't at least some more inclusivity. So yeah, it's possible that has changed. But at the time that I was doing the research, it was definitely not lost on the promoters, who would look around and see, all of the valuable social ties that they believed that they would be able to network with were white. They saw them, and they kind of saw themselves as outsiders and saw their opportunity to be among this space as being possible through all of these, beautiful white bodies that they were like cultivating. So and some promoters, I spent a lot of time in the book with a couple of promoters who are Black and brown immigrant men. And they had a really, I found, surprising sense of their racial classification as working to their advantage. They would say, like, okay, because I'm Black, white women are more attracted to me, right? Because of all of these racial stereotypes about Black masculine sexuality. And they would also say, and because I'm Black, I can see that these white rich people think that I'm more fun, I'm somehow exotic, that I have access to something that they're going to want, so they would kind of think about their own position, which on the one hand is, rife with all kinds of stereotypes and oppression, but they would also think about how to use it to their advantage.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
The Dig is a podcast produced in conjunction with Jacobin Magazine. And yes, Jacobin is a print publication, not just a place for online commentary, but long-form, serious print journalism and socialist analysis. The magazine is released quarterly and runs at around 160 pages, filled with award-winning design and the ideas that movements need to thrive. You can join more than 70,000 Jacobin subscribers supporting this vital work for just $15 for your first year. This is a huge discount available to Dig listeners. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's very extensive archive. Their latest issue is on aging. It describes the challenges facing welfare states, debates the value of generational analysis, and asks what kind of society our elders deserve. I highly recommend that you check it out. You can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. There's a link in the show notes.
So talk about what it actually is like once you're inside. What is the group of girls that the promoter has brought into this club? What are they bringing to the environment that these wealthy clients want so badly?
Yeah, so it's a large group of really tall, strikingly pretty women, and that alone communicates so much. Like just to walk by and see a kind of a gathering of women who look like they just came off of the catwalk is so striking to people that it immediately communicates like whichever man is in their presence must be important, right? Like that's there's like the part of like very important people that kind of manifests immediately is very striking to the eye. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned like they have the high heels, they're standing up, they're encouraged not to sit down, they're encouraged to stand up on top of the sofas and on top of the tables, right? So like everybody sees them. And it's so effective. It's really interesting. Even promoters who describe their own personal taste for a partner as not looking like a fashion model understood that they need to date fashion models and in order to accumulate more fashion models around them, because it'll signal to the clubs, it'll signal to the clients that they must be a person of value if they're surrounded by these beautiful women. And of course, the irony, of course, is that the models themselves, most of them are, they don't have any claims to material power, right? They're not getting paid for what they're doing. Maybe they're getting free drinks, they're getting a free night out, but it's nowhere near in comparison to the fungibility of assets that are being amassed by a club, which can charge, thousands of dollars more than a bottle of alcohol is worth, or the social capital that's being accumulated by all of these rich men who are able to signal their importance, to each other by virtue of being in this space. And so the women are creating all of this value just in their presence. So I often think of this as it's a world constructed by men and for men, but it's run on girls and it's run on their free labor. And I mean, this is a really important point, not just because it expands our idea of what labor is. They're not getting paid, but they're generating a whole bunch of value, but they are getting compensated in a way that feels just to them and it feels appropriate to them. But why don't they get actual money for what they're doing, right? And what I found was that women wanted to see their participation as fun and as leisure and not as labor. They didn't want to be confused with the other category of women who are in clubs who are getting paid for their bodies. And those are sex workers or women who are seen as too close to sex workers, like the bottle hostesses, the women that are cocktail waitressing and bringing the bottles. And they're seen as being more sexually available. People widely describe this as like a dirty job. So there's a strong kind of moral opprobrium to be expected against sex work, right? And a sense of shame if a woman is too strategic in monetizing her body. Women that were seen as going out for the wrong reasons would be women who are going out to meet a rich man or for like a wealthy husband. This was seen as someone described it as whale hunting, right? Or someone also described this as soft hooking, right? It's like being a hooker, but instead of explicit money, it's shoes and handbags. But all of this was looked down upon by the clients, by the promoter, and by the girls themselves, who didn't want to see themselves as close to sex workers. They didn't want to get paid. So quite paradoxically, even though they're generating all of this value, really what they gain is a symbolic value by being not paid. So
this is so fascinating because in every single interaction from the initial encounter on the street to showing up at the club and everything in between, there's this sense that the promoters especially are trying to cultivate of like, this is a fun lifestyle. We're having fun. We have genuine relationships with each other. I know my girls. I take care of my girls. The girls have relationships with each other. That is very central to how they are conceiving of what they are doing. But it's such a fine dance socially. There's so many red lines that you could cross at any moment where you go too far in this direction and all of a sudden you're seen as something like a sex worker, or you're, like you said, you're here for the wrong reasons. And so this permeates this entire world. You're constantly having to be sure that you don't run afoul of these actually quite rigid social norms that are expected of you and that you even want for yourself, because you don't want to think of yourself as somebody who is different from your own self-conception of why you're involved in this world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So one promoter puts it really well that everybody is using each other, but there's a difference between use and abuse. And people are like very aware of when that line has been crossed. But there's another point about this that I think is really kind of central to the whole argument of the book, is about how gender hierarchy operates through consent. So clearly there's exploitation happening here in a really sort of basic structural sense, meaning that men are in a better position to be able to extract value and make profit off of women's bodily capital, right? Women's beauty. So beauty, everybody talks about it. Economists always talk about it as an asset, right? More beautiful people get more doors open. They do better in the labor market. They do better in the marriage market, right? Particularly women. Okay, yes, all of that is true, but it really misses how beauty as a form of capital functions under conditions of patriarchy, because beauty is valuable for women. It opens all of these doors, but it produces value on a much greater scale for men, material value, whereas women are getting this symbolic sense of inclusion, of being in this. And so you could think of it as if you use the concept of traffic in women, and I don't mean trafficking women in the way like the U.S. State Department describes, a complete coercive system, but I mean traffic in the old anthropological sense of the word, in which women are exchanged among communities where the power holders are men, as a means to forge more power that goes to men. So women are, married off, sisters are married and daughters are married. And that's the sort of logic of creating kinship ties, strategic kinship ties through the circulation of women. I draw on the anthropologist Gail Rubin, who's drawing on Levi Strauss to make this argument. And what I saw in this VIP club was that indeed there's this circulation of women in which men are controlling the flow and men are profiting off of it. And women have that asset of beauty, but it's worth more in men's hands because they control the system. And why do women consent to a system of exploitation like that? You can't explain how the whole system operates without attending to the meanings and the pleasures and the symbolic gain that women get by participating in it. So they consent to it because it's meaningful to them. Promoters are making it very meaningful. That's their professional, that's what they do for a job, is to construct the relationship as fun, as meaningful, as reciprocity. Such that some of the girls would go out with promoters and say explicitly they didn't want to get paid, and they're just there to support their friend. And they know that promoters are making money. They know that the club, of course, they can see is making a lot of money. They didn't know exactly how much. Some of them were quite surprised to know that, like, oh, he's making $1,000 tonight. That's pretty high. But they're quite okay with that because it's fun for them. But the moment that they feel that there's abuse, that they've crossed a boundary, right? That they're confused with sex workers, or that they are not being treated equitably, or in the way that is fun. If they don't have fun, they just leave, and they definitely can. So So I think that traffic is a really great concept to apply in this case.
You talk repeatedly throughout the book about how promoters are trying to use their personal relationships that they have developed with these girls to try to get them to come out. And they use words like support. Will you come out and support me? Clearly trying to capitalize on these relationships that they have so assiduously built. Did you ever feel that yourself, since you kind of like became a part of this world for some of these promoters? Did you ever get the text from a promoter that's being like, Ashley, will you come out and support me? And you feel like a twinge of like, this guy did give me this meal. I do have this relationship with this guy. Like I do have to get out there and support him.
Well, yes, I felt it, but for different reasons. And that's because as an ethnographer, our research depends on getting people to like us and getting people to tolerate us and getting people to do an interview, which is it's a big ask for people. Tell me your life story, open up and tell me all of your intimate moments, right? It depends on what you're asking, but it's a time commitment, and I think it's an emotional commitment for somebody to open up to an ethnographer. And so, an ethos of feminist ethnography is that we want to give back to our subjects. We don't just want to take and run. We want to have an exchange and, have a meaningful role in their lives as they're doing for us. And so I did think that, like, okay, one way that I can be helpful to them as they're being helpful to me is to show up, because I know they always need girls to show up wearing their high heels. Yeah. So I tried very hard to keep that commitment. So every single promoter that I did interviews with, I would show up at least once, but often many more nights at his club. But I very quickly ran into the problem that led me to this main insight about gender and exploitation and traffic. And that was when I started going out with one promoter, and then I do some more interviews. Okay, I promised to go out with more promoters. And then the promoter from last week sees me out and he's like, "What are you doing out with him? You're my girl." And I understood right away, like, the possessive pronoun is so telling, because promoters see girls as a resource and they're trying to assert ownership over those girls, right? Like, this is the condition of creating a traffic a circuit of traffic. So I would have to very awkwardly say, like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing this research. And so I'm just trying to go in as many directions as possible." But I had too many invitations and I had too many obligations to try to fill them all. So I was dropping people left and right, but I would explain it as it's a research faux pas, not a personal failing.
It sounds like you're essentially implying to them, "I'm here because I'm a sociologist," and they're saying, "No, you're here because you're my girl."
Right. Yeah. But they're always using this possessive pronoun, like, these are my girls, look at my girls. Early on helped me see that girls function as a form of capital here, but it's not a straightforward, like, individual form of capital. Like, if you read Bourdieu, then you understand he's trying to enrich human and economic capital by accounting for culture, including the body, but it really remains as like an individual resource. Like, you can move through different fields and capitalize wherever your value gets recognized. And in this field, what I saw is that ownership really matters. And because the field is owned and operated by men, the value of all that capital goes to men. So indeed, even though promoters are making a pretty great wage, especially for people who didn't have any special skills training, some of the promoters were making like $250,000 a year. They felt quite frustrated that they couldn't crack into the upper echelons of the economic elite because they had fantasies that they would be able to do business with the people that they're servicing. Now, promoters that stay in their niche of nightlife and hospitality can do quite well. Like, they can meet investors to open up their own clubs or their own, a hotel or restaurant. And so they can find upward mobility if they stay kind of in their lane. But the promoters who were the kind of most tragic cases that I followed were the ones who imagined that they would be accepted among the elite and they'd be able to do like, business to business brokerage with like oil rich families from around the world. And in conversation with the clients, I understood that they didn't take the promoters seriously as anything other than entrepreneurs of the night.
Those sections of your book are kind of heartbreaking to read. I was reading about these promoters and thinking that they're largely pretty scuzzy people who are exploiting these girls. But then you get a sense through your conversations with them on this topic in particular that they believe what they are saying about their intimate relationships with these ultra wealthy clients. They're like, no, this is not just business. This is in the same way that they talk about their relationship with the girls as being like an actual significant personal relationship in their life. Like, no, I'm not just kissing the ass of this rich person to try to get money from him. Like, we actually have a substantive relationship. And then to hear them learn in real time, basically, that in fact, no, they don't really have that kind of relationship with these rich people. You kind of have to feel for this promoter a little bit because clearly their heart is being broken in that moment.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really an important thing that you picked up on, because when I started the project, this is probably my feminist training. I really saw the promoters as scuzzy kinds of characters. And I could imagine a book in which they are the very clear villains of it. And I thought that I would probably write in that way. And in spending more and more time with them, I really began to feel a kind of empathy with them through the proximity, through spending time and kind of seeing how they really embody the spirit of the American dream, right? The idea that like, doesn't matter where you come from, you can climb your way up. Yeah. And it's true that they really have climbed quite remarkably far, but it also shows the limits, I think, of social capital and girl capital, right? Like, it only takes them so far. The fact that they have these ties, it's a certain kind of tie that is predicated on a larger a hierarchy of like class and race. That's like a serious divide between them, disproportionately from, modest backgrounds and brown and black men trying to crack into and do business with this global elite. So it really shows the limits of what they're able to do, but also the frustrations that they feel because their definition of success comes to be you're the super rich. They can't see 250,000 a year as success.
Well, to me, that's part of the tragedy of what we're describing here, and the tragedy of when a social world becomes so oriented towards these ultra wealthy people that they become the standard by which more and more people begin to judge their sense of success and self-worth. And that's just it seems like a toxic thing for a society for more and more parts of a society, for a larger group of people to be making such ultra wealthy people the standard by which they judge whether or not they are successful in life, whether or not they're leading a meaningful life, leading the life that they want to live. It's all done in comparison to these ultra wealthy people, and it has this kind of trickle down effect on so many people and the rest of society.
Yeah, of course. And the way to show wealth is through positional goods because that communicates your status. But status is never absolute, right? It's always relative. It's always in relation to who has more. And unfortunately, our tendency as humans is to look up rather than down. So we're always comparing someone who's higher than us rather than, how far we've come ourselves, which means that with more economic inequality, with more wealth concentration, there's just always further to go. So it's never complete, this project of acquiring status.
Can you talk about the changes in this scene over time and how increasing economic inequality and also changes in the real estate market in cities like New York have changed the way that these clubs function? I mean, you're describing, it seems like most of the book is set in the meatpacking district of Manhattan. Recently, I watched, as part of my tour through some Al Pacino's filmography, I watched the film Cruising, which is set in the meatpacking district. I believe it came out in 1980. But at that time, the meatpacking district was completely, dead. That it was known as a place for sex workers to be hanging out, and the movie depicts gay BDSM clubs that are very far from the environment that you're discussing. They're not places for this kind of conspicuous consumption. It was like the site of these very marginalized and in many ways oppressed scenes of gay men who are engaging in sex acts. So within the course of only a few decades, the meatpacking district has been transformed from the kind of place where that kind of club would exist to now being this playground for the ultra wealthy. How is it that has happened?
Yeah, so the story of bottle service really is the story of the rising fortunes of a small fraction of New Yorkers who are working in finance, but also real estate as the prices start to increase in the city. You can see it in, I think, like the 1990s bottle service. There are many club owners and former promoters who take credit for creating bottle service as a phenomenon. But the kind of general story that most people agree is that a couple of club owners who disagree about which one were in Paris in the 1990s, and they saw bottle service as a convenience at a couple of chic cafes. Rather than go to wait at the bar to get your drink, the server could just bring the whole bottle to your table and they put the mixer and you mix it yourself. So they take this idea with them back to New York, and they offer bottle service really as a convenience at first to beat wait times at the line. But a club would be predicated, or like the success of a club would come down to ticket sales. So everybody pays to get into the door, and then you pay some money for a drink. And then bottle service goes then from being a convenience to being a means of distinction in a space to show that you've bought the right kind of bottle, or you have enough money to sit in the right kind of table. It sort of transforms the interior of a nightclub into hierarchized real estate. So people end up laying credit cards in order to rent a table for the night. Yeah, and then the better the table, the more expensive. And then if you want to show further, then you get the fireworks coming with all of your purchases. So that process from say the late 1990s until the time that I was doing the research in the early 2010s, coincides with this increase in money for people who are working in the fire professions, finance, insurance, real estate, the sort of economic drivers of the city. It coincides with a deregulation of financial services. And when you look at the charts of, when is the uptick of concentration of wealth, it really starts to take off in, say 80s and then for sure in the 1990s. So this transforms the real estate value and the kinds of amenities that are there in New York City quite drastically. So you see this a gentrification, or some urban scholars called super gentrification, right? The creation of these little bubbles for the ultra rich in cities that coincides with the police cracking down on homeless or otherwise undesirable populations, and the transformations of what were like big warehousing. It was the meatpacking districts. You have these like huge warehouses. They start to get bought up. First the artists come in, and then a couple of cafes and restaurants, and then the fashion studios. There's a lot of photographers who are operating or used to operate there, because now it's gotten so expensive that it's the meatpacking district now is like a mall. It's like big chains are now operating there. But in the 2000s, we have a lot of art galleries, a lot of fashion studios, and then a lot of upscale restaurants. So it maintains its allure of the historic grit of the city, with just a huge influx of money. And it's not just that the clubs that I was studying were in the meatpacking district; they were concentrated there, and often in the bottom of huge hotels as well, and that are very expensive hotels, because it's also attracting now international business people and international wealthy tourists who have a lot of money to just come and spend on this. The Disneyfication of the city becomes like a consumption playground for international elites as well. But there were clubs that were in the Midtown Manhattan, also around in Soho, just a higher concentration of them in the meatpacking. So it's more convenient for promoters to kind of, bring the girls to the restaurant there in the meatpacking and hit 2 or 3 clubs that are kind of close. But of course they can get in their SUVs and go to Midtown as well.
These clubs have been transformed, as you just mentioned, away from a focus on like general admission to the club and the rabble buying the filler, buying the entrance to the club and buying drinks, and the economically they are now more oriented towards these wealthy clients, which sounds like it has changed the clubbing experience, because the way that the club owners are meeting their bills for every month are by orienting towards these ultra wealthy people, which then, as we were mentioning earlier, seems to create a cascading sense of the entire enterprise is oriented towards meeting the whims and desires of these wealthy clients. And also the quote unquote filler is seeing these ostentatious displays of wealth, and that becomes aspirational to the promoters. You talk at length about how the promoters are seeing this, and this is what they are aspiring to. Even those who make a good amount of money, some of the promoters you talk about making, I think $200,000 to $250,000 a year, that's chump change to them. What they really want is to get on the level of these whales who are engaging in these incredibly conspicuous displays of consumption. And so it just seems to have a kind of, to make a moral judgment from my own point of view, like a poisonous impact on this whole ecosystem, because it all becomes about these rich people and their desires, and you come to aspire to what it is that they are doing in the club. And I assume this is just one form of this kind of conspicuous consumption that these people are engaging in, that these rich clients are engaging in, and that you could probably write any number of ethnographies about the other places that these people are the other social spaces, the other social ecosystems that are being created by these ultra wealthy clients in their attempts to find some place to light more piles of money on fire.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't disagree with the sense of moral judgment on it. And I think that many of the people that I spent a lot of time with that had been in the industry for a while also shared some of this. I mean, they would bemoan the transformation of nightlife had just become models and bottles, and it was so formulaic, and it was quite dull, and it was less diverse. A lot of the clubs that I studied in New York were owned and operated by former promoters who had got their bearings in the industry, not as image promoters, doing VIP clubs, but rather doing those, like, I don't know, more underground clubs or like mass clubs in the 1990s, like Limelight or Tunnel, places that were also biker bars. A couple of people had started in, much more diverse economically, racially kinds of places. And then they kind of built the Rolodex. And then as people, their clientele have more money and have more desires for showing their money, then they start to evolve and create nightclubs that appeal to them and can make a lot of money as well. That said, there's like whatever your taste is, there will be a club for you somewhere in the world, and especially in a city like New York, right? We know that there's a really vibrant, like, underground electronic music scene. I just read a book called Long Live Queer Nightlife about the underground gay clubs in London, right? And they're kind of like radically inclusive in the way that they want everybody, from all genders and all class backgrounds to come and share in a night and feel joy in that. So there's many ways of doing nightlife. The way that this segment of the nightlife economy evolved, indeed, it increasingly appeals to and replicates a certain image of elite tastes, which is extremely heteronormative, quite patriarchal, like quite white supremacist. And I would not be surprised to find similar dynamics that are replicating in the art world or, whatever kind of luxury services you want to look at.
You have this great quote in the book where you're reflecting on how promoters are mobilizing these girls to show up to the dinners and to the clubs and do what the promoters want them to do. And you summarize it by saying, quote, "Exploitation works best when it feels good," unquote. And that this is really central to what everybody is doing here. But it's essential to keeping the girls who are being exploited to continue to showing up, that affective dimension of the work, the labor that they're putting into this has to feel good to them, because otherwise they would not continue to show up in these spaces, which are obviously designed to be creating pleasure. So if they're not experiencing some form of pleasure, even if we can see that their labor here is being exploited, they're not being compensated for it, that at least they need to feel good in some way while doing it. And that is the sort of juice that allows the entire system to run.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think that this is a central piece of the puzzle that we have to attend seriously as analysts if we want to understand why people participate in systems that are unfair. Coercion is part of the story, but I think it's much more vulnerable to challenge and critique than is pleasure. When somebody finds pleasure in a system, even if they know that it's oppressive, I think that's much harder to dismantle. And I would have to say too, if any of the women that I spent time with and interviewed for this book, if they were to hear me talk about it, or if they read the book, I don't think they'd be too surprised, right? They would be like, yeah, but I'm in my 20s, I'm in New York. Like, this was a great 2 years of my life. So I think that attending to pleasure and the felt sense of joy in spaces that to outsiders look ridiculous or disgusting or outrageous, I think is really important to do. And so I'll just give you like a short story about this. I gave a talk about this at the American Sociological Association years ago. And I remember like a senior cultural sociologist, like prominent scholar in the field, she came up to me afterwards, really puzzled. She was like, "Is it fun? Like, is it fun to go out like this?" And I was like, it's really hard to convey like how seductive the pleasures of inclusion are, to be included in the very important people space, which is inherently exclusive, right? But it's hard to convey that when you're at a sociology conference, right, or on a podcast. But all of the women that I had interviewed really got something out of it, and that's why they gave so much into it. And I would also say that the fact of being included, part of why it feels good, and this is super problematic, is that it means other people are excluded. It means that you're good enough to be considered beautiful, and that's a relational construct, which means that somebody else got excluded for not being as beautiful. So it creates these hierarchies, not just between women and men, but it also creates these hierarchies among women. And being on the upper parts of that hierarchy is itself quite seductive, and is also a means of pleasure, which is deeply problematic.
When I was reading the book, I kept thinking about this meme that's been fairly prominent on Twitter and elsewhere in recent years about bosses trying to prevent their workers from unionizing. And the whole joke is like, the boss doesn't want you to have a union. He doesn't want to pay you more in wages, but he will throw you a pizza party and try to make you feel like you're a member of the family. We care about you. So we've got a pizza party for you. And there's one that's been going around recently that's like a boss with a gigantic, supersized pizza, and it says like on the underside of the pizza box, like, please don't unionize. And so it seems like what you're describing is sort of like an ultra high-end version of this. Like the pizza tastes way better in the VIP club, like the equivalent of what the pizza is, like the affective pleasures are more the boss, quote unquote, who is exploiting these girls has much more to offer them than, takeout from Domino's. But like fundamentally, the dynamic is the same, and fundamentally, the people who are doing the exploiting are working very hard to make these girls happy enough with the pizza that they don't decide to leave.
Right, absolutely. It has to be worthwhile to participate.
I mean, this is what Marxists are why they're so concerned with the development of class consciousness. Like this, in order to convince a given workforce that they are being exploited and that they need to organize in order to change their conditions or whatever. I mean, the first part of that is to realize that this is indeed what's happening and the world could look different. I mean, obviously that's maybe easier if you're working on a grimy auto factory line, or if you're an exploited, non-tenure track professor at a college. It's easier to convince those kind of workers that what is happening to them is exploitative and abusive than it is to convince somebody who is out at a VIP club. Maybe for no other reason than that the air, the environment, the atmosphere of that place is saturated with the intoxications of the wealthy. Like what's happening there is you get to hang out with these rich people, and so you get to feel like you're one of them. And as you mentioned, that's a heady mix to be contending with in your own mind.
Part of the value of being a girl is precisely not getting paid for it. Do you see what I mean? Like they go out and they're not in the category of a wage earner. They're there getting the complimentary meal, which is quite a compliment to get included, right? They're getting all of this free stuff, and that the value comes from not getting paid. So I think that it's really different to imagine like waking girls up, to the system of exploitation, which when their labor is deliberately defined as leisure. Yeah. And there's something really at stake to recognize it as labor, which means that you're no longer, in the category of being, just complimented alone.
You have conversations with some of these girls in the book where you're, skirting around this issue of whether what they are doing is labor. And they all are like, absolutely not. This is not what we're doing, because they don't want to change how they experience this experience affectively.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I also, at one point, I was like, okay, we could maybe arbitrage the market here. I've got like 8 good looking friends from the modeling industry. Let's come together and talk to a club owner, and let's agree that we each get $100 for the night. We'll show up and get our champagne bottles and stay at the table. And rather than the promoter getting paid $1,000 a night, right? Like we could do this ourselves. And they were all like, no, no, not interested, because they don't want to go out for work. They're not going out for money. They're going out for fun. It's very different things if you go out for money. That's a desperate thing.
The prospect for a girls' worker co-op is very far in the future, it sounds. So
Right.
where is this world going? The research that you did for this book was a decade ago. Assumedly, this world has probably changed significantly since, given all the ways the world has changed over the last decade. But where is it going? Where are these kinds of rituals of conspicuous consumption headed? This is beyond the scope of your research for this book, but assumedly you followed it somewhat over the years since you were involved in it. Where do you think this? What kind of changes have taken place and are going to take place in this kind of world?
Yeah, sure. So there was a resurgence in the mass promotions for big clubs that were driven by ticket sales pre-COVID in places like Brooklyn. So we saw this, that's partly the rise of the electronic music scene globally. So that's an opportunity for more inclusive kinds of clubbing, less driven by VIP and image promotions. And after the publication of the book, I received emails from some people who were nightlife entrepreneurs, and they wanted to have conversations about how they could open a more inclusive club and still be profitable, right? So can you make a VIP club that doesn't have this hierarchy and exclusions that are, very heteronormative and kind of, archaic in some ways? And we had interesting conversations. They didn't end up opening those clubs, and I had some doubts about whether a club predicated on, like VIP is predicated on hierarchy, if that can be inclusive, what would it actually look like? I think that there's been an uptick in more private social clubs, so like members only clubs, like Soho House in New York. So
Zero Bond, where our illustrious mayor spends a lot of time. That's another private club.
Right. These are places that have their own exclusions kind of built in, so they can be treated like private spaces. So I'm not sure what's happening in club world at the moment. I mean, I have been out lately, and it looked. So I went to one of these kinds of spaces, and it seemed very familiar to me. I was just out a couple of weeks ago in New York, and I'm sure that the contents of consumption can always change, but I think the fact of hierarchy persists. So it doesn't really matter what the next thing will be, but I do think that with the shape and nature of economic inequality and wealth concentration today, we're not going to see any lessening of unequal access to whatever that thing is.
Ashley Mears, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
That was my guest host, Jacobin editor Micah Utricht, interviewing Ashley Mears, a professor of sociology and women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Boston University. She's the author of Pricing Beauty, The Making of a Fashion Model, and Very Important People, Status and Beauty in the Global Party Circuit. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, to the capitalist, every luxury of the worker seems to be so reprehensible, and everything that goes beyond the most abstract need, be it in the realm of passive enjoyment or a manifestation of activity, seems to him a luxury. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theo Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at thedigradio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or another such site, please leave us a glowing review. If it is on Spotify, please contact Spotify and ask them why it is impossible to find The Dig on Spotify. This is infuriating. Please help. And also, please do tell your friends about the pod. Please make propaganda for us. And please do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation going strong. Even a few bucks is huge.